I should have recognized the warning signs when my mother started asking about my architectural projects with genuine enthusiasm instead of her usual passive-aggressive commentary about my absent social life. But I was too buried in the blueprints for the Riverside commercial complex to notice her scheming until it was far too late. For nearly a month, she'd been suspiciously supportive, asking intelligent questions about load-bearing walls and sustainable materials, nodding thoughtfully when I explained the challenges of incorporating green spaces into urban development. And not once had she mentioned her friend Dorothy's daughter, who'd just gotten engaged to an orthodontist, or her colleague's niece who was expecting her second child. The trap was beautifully laid, and I walked right into it on a Tuesday evening when she called me at the office with that particular tone in her voice that meant she'd already made decisions on my behalf and was simply informing me as a courtesy. "Sweetheart, you remember my college roommate Patricia, don't you? Her son Daniel is in town from Seattle for some business meetings, and he specifically asked if you might be free for dinner this Friday." The words tumbled out in one breath, rehearsed and polished, leaving no room for the refusal that was already forming on my lips. I set down my pencil and stared at the half-finished elevation drawing in front of me, already knowing how this conversation would end because we'd had variations of it at least a dozen times before. "Mom, absolutely not, we've been through this, and the answer is always the same. Rachel, darling, it's just one dinner between two professionals who happen to share an interest in architecture and design. And honestly, what possible harm could come from spending 2 hours having an intelligent conversation?" Her voice had that practiced innocence that meant she was prepared for every objection I might raise, every excuse I might manufacture, every defensive wall I might try to build. The harm, I wanted to tell her, was that I'd been on exactly 6 blind dates in my 32 years, and each one had followed the same predictable script that ended with me driving home alone, while pretending I didn't notice the relief in my date's eyes when we said our goodbyes. I'm not naive about what I see in the mirror every morning. A woman who wears size 18 with confidence that I've built like armor over years of society's messages about bodies that don't conform to some arbitrary standard. My face is attractive enough, with sharp cheekbones inherited from my grandmother and eyes that make the moment of recognition worse when my dates realize that the pretty face comes attached to a body that doesn't match whatever image they'd constructed from a carefully cropped photograph. But my mother had that quality in her voice that meant she'd already confirmed with Patricia, already made the reservation at some restaurant I probably couldn't afford, already backed me into a corner where refusing would make me the difficult, ungrateful daughter. Fine, one dinner, but when this inevitably crashes and burns in exactly the way we both know it will, you're going to stop colluding with your friends to ambush me with their single sons, agreed? I wore black instead because armor needs to be dark, impenetrable, a visual warning that I wasn't some hopeful romantic who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Magnolia Hall turned out to be one of those restaurants where the lighting was deliberately dim and flattering. The servers wore actual bow ties instead of clip-ons, and the prices weren't printed on the menu because if you had to ask, you probably shouldn't be eating there in the first place. The hostess checked her reservation book with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ancient religious texts, then led me through a maze of white-clothed tables where beautiful people murmured to each other over wine that cost more than my monthly electric bill. He was already seated at a corner table, and when he stood to greet me, my first coherent thought was that Patricia had either sent a photograph from 15 years ago, or her son had discovered some kind of reverse aging serum. Daniel Wright was perhaps 40, with dark hair just beginning to show distinguished silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for his frame. His eyes met mine without the telltale flicker of surprise or disappointment that I'd learned to recognize in the first 3 seconds of every blind date, which was somehow more unsettling than the usual micro-expression of regret would have been. "Rachel Hartley?" His voice was deep and measured, professional without being cold, the kind of voice that probably commanded boardrooms and made junior executives nervous during quarterly reviews. "That would be me. And you must be the Daniel who's supposedly fascinated by sustainable architecture. Though I have to admit I'm skeptical about whether that interest is genuine or just something your mother invented to make this setup sound more appealing." I slid into the chair across from him and watched his face carefully, looking for the crack in his polite facade, the moment when he'd realize his mother had misrepresented the situation. His mouth quirked into something that might have been amusement. Daniel, right, and my mother actually undersold your work, because that piece in Architecture Digest about integrating natural water flow into commercial spaces was genuinely brilliant. Though she did fail to mention that you'd be this direct, which is refreshing after spending the last week in meetings with people who take 20 minutes to say what could be communicated in 2 sentences. The server materialized instantly, presenting leather-bound menus and reciting specials that involved ingredients I'd only heard of in cooking shows. And I found myself studying Daniel's face for any sign of what was coming next because in my experience, the disappointment was always coming. We ordered. I chose the herb-crusted salmon because it seemed safe and was positioned in the middle price range, where I wouldn't appear either cheap or presumptuous, while Daniel requested the same thing, which felt oddly considerate in a way that made me suspicious of his motives. The conversation started with the kind of careful small talk that 2 strangers engage in when they're both trying to assess whether the next 2 hours will be merely awkward or actively painful. But somewhere around the time our appetizers arrived, something shifted and I found myself actually engaged in a discussion about the challenges of retrofitting older commercial buildings with modern environmental systems without destroying their historical character. Daniel knew what he was talking about, asking questions that demonstrated he'd actually read architectural journals and understood the tension between preservation and progress. And I realized with growing unease that I was enjoying myself in a way that felt dangerous, because enjoyment meant lowering my guard, and lowering my guard meant vulnerability. He told me about his work in Seattle, where his company developed software for construction project management, and somehow made what could have been deadly boring actually interesting by focusing on the human problems his technology was trying to solve. The biggest challenge isn't the coding or the interface design, he explained, cutting into his appetizer with precise movements that suggested someone who'd been taught proper table manners from childhood. It's convincing contractors who've been doing things the same way for 30 years that there's value in changing their workflow, because you're not just asking them to learn new software. You're asking them to fundamentally reimagine how they approach project management. I found myself leaning forward, genuinely curious now despite my better judgment. So you actually go to construction sites? I'm having trouble imagining someone in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent climbing around on scaffolding. I own jeans and steel-toed boots too, shocking as that might be, he said with a slight smile that transformed his entire face from merely handsome to something more interesting and complicated. My father built the company from nothing, and one of the few valuable lessons he taught me before he passed was that you can't design solutions for people whose problems you don't actually understand on a ground level. The entrees arrived, presented like edible art installations, and I was acutely aware of how easily we'd fallen into this rhythm of genuine conversation. He asked about my current projects with follow-up questions that indicated he was actually listening rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. And that's when something inside me snapped. Let me save us both the rest of this charade, I said, setting down my fork with more force than I'd intended. I've done this enough times to know exactly how it ends, and I'd rather we just acknowledge the reality of the situation right now instead of dragging it out through dessert and coffee and awkward promises to call that we both know are never going to happen. Daniel's expression didn't change immediately, but I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or maybe just recalculation as he adjusted whatever script he'd been following for this evening. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to acknowledge, Rachel, but I get the feeling you're about to tell me whether I want to hear it or not. What I'm telling you is that we can both stop pretending this is anything other than what it is, which is your mother and my mother conspiring to set up their respective children, because they can't accept that we're both perfectly fine being single. The words came out sharper than I'd planned, edged with years of accumulated disappointment that I usually kept buried under professional competence and carefully maintained boundaries. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone is thinking. No one marries a fat girl, sir, no matter how brilliant her Architecture Digest feature was, or how fascinating her thoughts on sustainable design might be. The silence that followed felt heavy and dense, like the air before a thunderstorm when all the oxygen has been sucked out of the atmosphere. Other diners continued their conversations around us, unaware of the small detonation that had just occurred at our corner table. And Daniel sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable in a way that suggested he was choosing his next words very carefully. "Did my mother show you a photograph of me before you agreed to this dinner?" he asked finally, his voice level and controlled. What does that have to do with anything? It's a simple question that actually has quite a bit to do with the assumptions you just made about my motivations and my capacity for deception. He leaned back slightly, creating more space between us without actually moving away from the table. Because my mother didn't show me a photograph of you. She simply told me that you were brilliant and accomplished and probably too smart to fall for whatever charm I might try to deploy. I stared at him, trying to find the angle, the manipulation, the polite lie. So you're telling me you came to this dinner with absolutely no expectations, and you're not at all disappointed? I'm telling you that I came to this dinner hoping to meet someone interesting enough to make me forget about the absolutely brutal week I've had dealing with investors who don't understand the technology they're funding and employees threatening to walk out over compensation disputes, he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, like he'd dropped his own armor just slightly. And what I found when you walked up to this table was someone who clearly has been hurt enough times that she's decided to hurt herself first before anyone else gets the chance, which I understand more than you might think, but which also makes this conversation significantly more complicated than I was prepared for on a Friday evening. The server appeared at exactly the wrong moment, professionally oblivious to the tension crackling across our table, asking if we were enjoying our meals. Daniel handled the interruption smoothly, requesting a few more minutes, while I tried to figure out whether I was more angry at him for not following the script I'd written in my head or at myself for potentially sabotaging something that might have been different. I apologize, I said once the server had retreated. That was unfair and presumptuous, and you didn't deserve to have all of my accumulated baggage from previous disasters dumped on you before we'd even finished our entrees. Don't apologize for being honest, even if the honesty is uncomfortable. He picked up his wine glass but didn't drink, just held it like he needed something to do with his hands. But I do want to address what you said, because I think you're operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about my situation and my intentions. And while I understand that past experience has taught you to expect disappointment, I'm not particularly interested in being judged by other people's failures. Then what are you interested in? Right now? Finishing this excellent salmon and having a conversation with someone who doesn't bore me to tears, which is increasingly rare in my world. He set down the wine glass and met my eyes directly. I'm 39 years old, Rachel, and I've dated extensively enough to know that attraction is complicated and chemistry doesn't follow logical patterns or societal expectations about what bodies are supposed to look like. And I'm genuinely insulted that you think I'm shallow enough to reduce you to a single physical characteristic when I've spent the last 45 minutes being impressed by your intelligence. I wanted to believe him, but belief felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. People say a lot of things across dinner tables that don't survive contact with reality outside of restaurants where the lighting is dim and the wine is flowing. Fair enough, which is why I'm going to make you a proposition that doesn't require you to trust anything I'm saying right now. Finish dinner with me, not as a date if that label carries too much weight, but as two professionals who were ambushed by their well-meaning mothers and who might as well make the best of an evening that's already been paid for and planned, Daniel said, resuming eating with casual ease like we were discussing the weather rather than negotiating whether this evening would extend beyond its current boundaries. Then, if you walk out of here still convinced that I'm full of polite lies and ultimately going to disappoint you, I'll accept that judgment and you'll never hear from me again. But if there's even a small possibility that you might be wrong about my motivations, then maybe we try this again under circumstances where you're not waiting for the other shoe to drop. The proposition hung in the air between us, and I realized that he'd managed to do something that none of my previous dates had ever attempted. He'd acknowledged my defenses without trying to dismantle them through sheer force of charm, giving me space to make a choice rather than trying to convince me that my protective instincts were wrong or misplaced. I'm getting dessert regardless of what I decide, I said finally, because the chocolate souffle here is supposedly exceptional, and I've already endured enough of this evening to deserve something decadent. His smile was quick and genuine. I would be disappointed if you did anything else, and for what it's worth, I was planning to order the same thing, because life is too short to skip dessert, just because some outdated social convention says it's not sophisticated. The souffle arrived in individual ramekins, perfectly risen and accompanied by vanilla bean ice cream that was clearly made in-house, and Daniel insisted on ordering a dessert wine that he promised would complement the chocolate without overwhelming it. We ate in companionable silence for a few moments, and I found myself relaxing incrementally despite all my carefully maintained defenses. My father died when I was 30, Daniel said suddenly, apropos of nothing we'd been discussing. Heart attack at his desk, completely unexpected. And I inherited a company that I wasn't remotely prepared to run because I'd spent my 20s deliberately avoiding the family business, trying to prove I could succeed on my own merits. I set down my spoon, recognizing the shift in conversational tone. That must have been overwhelming. Overwhelming doesn't begin to cover it. I was terrified and completely out of my depth, making decisions that affected 300 employees without any real understanding of the company culture or the relationships my father had built over 30 years. He stared at his dessert like it held answers. I almost destroyed everything in the first 18 months, drove away half the senior staff, including my uncle who'd been my father's partner since the beginning, and generally proved that inheriting a successful company doesn't automatically grant you the wisdom to run it. But you obviously recovered, given that you're here in an expensive restaurant on a business trip. I kept my voice neutral, curious about where this confession was leading. I recovered because I finally accepted that I didn't have to do everything alone, that asking for help wasn't weakness, but the only rational response to being in over your head. He pushed the ramekin away, appetite apparently abandoned. My uncle still won't speak to me outside of mandatory family gatherings, but the company survived and eventually thrived, and I learned that success often looks messier than the polished stories we tell. Why are you telling me this? Because you spent the first half of this dinner assuming I was some kind of perfect package, and I wanted you to understand that I'm carrying my own complicated history and failures that have shaped how I approach relationships and trust. I agreed to see him again, though I spent the entire next day questioning my judgment and changing outfits 4 times before settling on dark jeans and a burgundy blouse that felt casual enough to not look like I'd tried too hard. Daniel picked me up at 6:30. Now wearing jeans himself and a black sweater that made him look less CEO and more like someone I might actually know in real life. And he greeted me with coffee in a to-go cup because he'd remembered I'd mentioned my afternoon had been consumed by a difficult client meeting. The Morrison Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that provided the perfect backdrop for massive black and white photographs that dominated the walls. The exhibition was titled Structural Poetry, and featured architectural photography that emphasized geometry and shadow, transforming familiar building types into abstract compositions. We moved through the space slowly, and I found myself genuinely absorbed rather than performing interest, stopping in front of a photograph of a brutalist structure shot from below that made it look simultaneously monumental and somehow fragile. "This is what people misunderstand about brutalism," I said, aware that I was falling into lecture mode but unable to stop myself. "They see concrete and harsh lines, and they think it's about aggression or lack of care. But look at how the photographer has captured the light hitting these surfaces. There's an intentionality here, a deliberate choice to create something that makes you feel small and overwhelmed. And that's not accident or laziness, that's architectural purpose being deployed with precision." Daniel studied the photograph thoughtfully rather than merely politely. "So you're saying the point is to make people uncomfortable?" "Not uncomfortable exactly, but definitely not comfortable in that easy, unthinking way that most commercial architecture aims for." I moved closer to examine the textural details. The best architecture challenges you, makes you reconsider your relationship to space and scale and purpose. And yes, sometimes that means creating buildings that aren't trying to be your friend, but rather trying to be your teacher or your antagonist. "That's a remarkably aggressive philosophy for someone who designs commercial office buildings," he observed with amusement rather than criticism. "Who says I only design commercial buildings? The commercial work pays the bills and builds the reputation, but I take on residential projects that interest me. And I'm currently working on a community center for an underserved neighborhood that will never make me any money, but will hopefully create a gathering space that transforms how people interact." I caught myself revealing more than I'd intended. "Sorry, you didn't sign up for my architectural manifesto. Actually, I specifically invited you because I wanted to hear exactly this kind of passionate rambling about buildings," he said, moving toward the next photograph. "My previous girlfriend thought my work was boring and couldn't understand why I got excited about project management software. And somewhere around the 3rd breakup that cited my work as the primary problem, I realized I needed to find someone who understood that what you do professionally isn't separate from who you are. The confession felt significant, like he was deliberately drawing parallels, showing me that he understood the importance of finding someone who valued your passions rather than tolerating them as obstacles. 3 weeks became 6, and somehow Daniel Wright had woven himself into my life with a casual inevitability that should have terrified me, but instead felt oddly natural, like he'd found a space that had been empty without my realizing it. We fell into patterns. Tuesday dinners at a ramen place near my office where the portions were generous and the atmosphere discouraged romantic pretense. Weekend coffee meetings that turned into long walks discussing buildings we loved and buildings we wanted to demolish. Late-night phone calls when one of us was stuck at the office and needed someone who understood the particular frustrations of work that mattered more than it probably should. He met my best friend Amanda over brunch at her insistence, showing up with pastries from the bakery she'd mentioned loving in a casual comment 3 weeks earlier, demonstrating attention to detail that Amanda later described as either genuinely thoughtful or concerningly good at manipulation. And I honestly can't tell which, but I'm choosing to be optimistic because you seem happier than I've seen you in years. He asked smart questions about her work managing a nonprofit theater company and didn't condescend about the arts the way some business people did. And by the end of the meal, Amanda was texting me under the table with increasingly emphatic emojis that roughly translated to "do not screw this up" through self-sabotage. But I was waiting for the inevitable complication, the moment when reality would intrude on this strange bubble we'd created. It arrived on a Thursday evening when Daniel called sounding exhausted and frustrated, explaining that his uncle had showed up unannounced at the Seattle office and created a scene in front of clients, accusing Daniel of betraying his father's vision and running the company into moral bankruptcy through aggressive expansion strategies that prioritize profit over people. "The worst part is he's not entirely wrong," Daniel said, and I could hear him pacing. "We've been pushing into markets that probably aren't sustainable long-term, and I've been approving partnerships that make financial sense but feel ethically questionable. And I've been telling myself it's necessary for growth, when really it's just me trying to prove something to a dead man." I'd never heard him sound this raw and uncertain, and I found myself responding with the same honesty he'd shown me. "So change it. You're the CEO, which means you actually have the power to redirect the company toward the principles your father supposedly cared about. And yes, it might cost you some board support and maybe some short-term revenue, but you just told me that the current path feels wrong. And in my experience, things that feel wrong usually are wrong regardless of how we justify them intellectually." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if I'd overstepped, but then he laughed, though it sounded tired. "You're absolutely right, and I knew you would be, which is why I called you instead of my executive team, who would have just told me what they thought I wanted to hear. Happy to provide brutal honesty whenever you need it. It's considerably more than charming, Rachel. It's essential, and it's rare, and it's part of why I'm falling for you despite all the very logical reasons we should probably be taking this slower." The words came out casual, but hit me like physical impact. "Daniel, you can't just." "I can, and I am, because I'm tired of pretending this is casual when we both know it stopped being casual somewhere around week 3. Is your heart racing? Mine too. Subscribe and hit the bell for the next chapter. Comment below. Is Daniel moving too fast, or is this real love? Your thoughts matter. His company's annual charity gala arrived with unfortunate timing. Just 3 days after his unexpected confession had left me emotionally off balance and questioning every assumption I'd built about relationships and vulnerability. Daniel had invited me weeks earlier, and backing out now would have been cowardly in a way that would have proven every defensive instinct I'd ever had was justified. So I bought a new dress, midnight blue silk that cost more than I'd ever spent on clothing but fit perfectly, making me feel elegant rather than merely acceptable, and told myself I could survive one evening in his professional world. The gala was exactly as advertised, all glittering chandeliers and designer gowns, and the particular kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself through obvious displays, but rather through subtle details like the quality of champagne and casual discussions of second homes. Daniel met me at the entrance wearing a tuxedo that looked constructed specifically for his body, and when he saw me, his entire face transformed in a way that made me feel genuinely beautiful. "You're extraordinary," he said simply, offering his arm with old-fashioned formality. And together we entered the ballroom where apparently everyone who mattered in Seattle tech had gathered to celebrate their own generosity, while networking furiously. The evening started well. Daniel introduced me to colleagues and investors with genuine pride, always describing me as Rachel Hartley, the architect, with context about my work that demonstrated he'd been paying attention. I met his CFO, who turned out to be a woman around my age with sharp humor and zero patience for pretension, and we ended up having an unexpectedly engaging conversation about similarities between financial modeling and architectural planning. But then I saw them. Two women in designer gowns standing near the bar, one leaning toward the other to whisper, while both openly stared in my direction. I watched the first woman's expression shift from curiosity to something that looked like barely concealed amusement. Saw the second woman raise her eyebrows in a gesture that communicated volumes about what they were thinking regarding Daniel's choice of companion. The old familiar shame crashed over me like a wave, washing away the confidence I'd been building all evening. I made it through another 20 minutes on autopilot before excusing myself to find the restroom, needing escape from the relentless visibility of being the only woman in the room who didn't look like she belonged in a fashion magazine. The ladies' room was blessedly empty, and I stood in front of the mirror trying to repair my composure along with my makeup, furious with myself for letting strangers' opinions matter. The door opened and a woman entered, tall, impeccably dressed, with bone structure that suggested Scandinavian ancestry. She moved to the mirror beside me, and instead of ignoring me in the way strangers in bathrooms typically do, she met my eyes in our shared reflection. "You're with Daniel, right?" she said, and it wasn't a question. I turned to face her directly, armor snapping back into place with practiced efficiency. "I am, and if you've come in here to share your thoughts on that particular situation, I'd appreciate it if you'd just be direct rather than dancing around whatever you're really trying to say." She laughed, but it wasn't unkind. "God, no wonder he likes you. That's exactly the kind of directness he's been complaining is missing from most of his social interactions." She extended her hand. "Catherine Morrison, I'm Daniel's business partner on the Tech Incubator project, and I actually came in here specifically to find you because I saw what happened out there with those vipers by the bar, and I wanted to apologize on behalf of Seattle's embarrassingly small-minded social elite who apparently never evolved past high school cafeteria dynamics." I shook her hand automatically, thrown completely off script. "I'm not sure what you think you saw, but I'm perfectly capable of handling a few judgmental looks from strangers who don't matter." "I'm sure you are, but you shouldn't have to, especially not at an event about supporting youth education." Catherine leaned against the counter with casual confidence. "Those particular women are venture capitalists' wives who spend their days on charity boards gossiping and occasionally approving small grants to make themselves feel important. And they've been circling Daniel for years hoping he'd date someone from their approved pool of acceptable candidates. So naturally they're threatened by anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of suitable. And you're telling me this why? Because Daniel is one of the few genuinely decent people in this industry who hasn't let success turn him into an insufferable egomaniac. And I've watched him date a parade of women who looked perfect on paper, but made him progressively more miserable. And the way he talks about you suggests he's actually happy for the first time since I've known him." She pulled out her lipstick, applying it with practiced precision. "Also, because those women out there are fundamentally unserious people who contribute nothing of value beyond their inherited wealth and their ability to make others feel small, and I believe in actively working against their influence whenever possible." We returned to the ballroom together, and Daniel found me almost immediately, his expression concerned. "Are you all right? I saw you heading toward the restrooms, and you looked upset." "Your business partner is surprisingly fierce," I said, trying for lightness even though my emotional state was still precarious. "She essentially threatened violence on my behalf against some women I don't even know." Catherine appeared beside us with champagne. "I did no such thing. I merely pointed out that certain individuals have all the depth of decorative soap, and their opinions should be weighted accordingly." She handed us each a glass. "Daniel, your girlfriend is delightful, and I'm formally declaring my approval, which means you're no longer allowed to screw this up through typical male emotional incompetence." "Noted and appreciated," Daniel said with genuine warmth, then turned to me with concern unmistakable in his eyes. "Do you want to leave? We can extract ourselves without anyone questioning it." The offer was genuine, but something in me refused to let strangers chase me away. "No, we're staying, because I refuse to let a couple of judgmental people run me off from something that's important to you professionally, and also because I promised myself I'd survive this entire evening without retreating into my usual defensive patterns. We spent the next hour navigating the social landscape together, and I found myself relaxing as Daniel's colleagues proved considerably more welcoming than anticipated. By the time the formal program began with speeches about technology education and a video showing last year's funding impact, I'd almost forgotten my earlier panic. Daniel gave a speech that managed to be both professionally polished and genuinely passionate, and I felt unexpected pride watching him command the room's attention. The evening was winding down when Daniel pulled me onto the mostly empty dance floor, his hand warm against the small of my back as we swayed to something slow and classical that the string quartet was playing with excessive romance. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly, his breath warm against my temple. "Thank you for being here, for being brave enough to walk into my world even when it's intimidating and uncomfortable. And thank you for being exactly who you are without apology or compromise." I looked up at him, at this impossible man who'd smiled at my defensive truth bombs and shared my chocolate cake, and introduced me with pride to everyone who mattered in his professional life. I'm still terrified, still waiting for this to fall apart, still half convinced that this is temporary and you'll eventually realize you made a mistake. I know you're terrified, and I know you're waiting for disappointment, but I'm not going anywhere. His hand tightened on my waist. I meant what I said before. I'm falling in love with you, Rachel Hartley, and I'm going to keep showing up and proving it until you finally believe me. And even then I'm not stopping because apparently I've become the kind of person who makes grand romantic declarations at charity galas. That's possibly the least romantic setting for a declaration I can imagine. I said, but I was smiling despite the tears that were threatening to ruin my carefully applied makeup. Romance is overrated. I prefer honesty even when it's messy and poorly timed and delivered on a dance floor in front of 300 people who are pretending not to watch us. He pulled back slightly to look at me directly. So here's my honest truth. I love you. I want to build something real with you despite the logistics and the distance and the complications. And I'm asking you to take this leap with me even though I can't promise it won't be difficult or scary or occasionally frustrating. I kissed him then, there on the dance floor with the string quartet playing, and the Seattle elite watching and judging, and probably forming opinions that I'd never care about. And for the first time in my life, I felt beautiful not because of how I looked, but because of how I was seen by someone who actually mattered. "I love you too," I whispered against his mouth. And yes, I'm taking the leap, because apparently I've become the kind of person who believes in second chances and grand romantic gestures, and the possibility that sometimes love actually works out the way it's supposed to. 6 months later, he proposed with a ring he'd designed himself. An architectural sketch of a bay window that caught light just right, honoring the grandmother who'd first taught me to see beauty in intentional design. I said yes without hesitation, without fear, without the defensive armor I'd worn for so long. Because sometimes the best love stories start with someone looking past the surface and choosing to see the truth underneath. And sometimes that truth is extraordinary enough to build a life on. Did Rachel and Daniel's story make you believe in love? Like this video, subscribe for more heartfelt romance tales, and comment below with your favorite moment. Should I write a sequel about their wedding? Let me know. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to hear that real love sees beyond appearances.